Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to your Easter break flip, where we're gonna keep talking about World War I. Kirsch, I know you're excited. Now, anyway, so we left off in class talking a lot about like weaponry and how the face of this war would change. Now, just to give you a heads up, we talked a lot about like mustard gas, we talked about semi-automatic rifles, we talked about automatic rifles, we talked about, like, we can talk about things for days, right? You can talk about grenades, you can talk about tanks, you can talk about airplanes, you can talk about submarines, you can talk about dreadnoughts, you can talk about all this stuff. The thing about it, though, is what we were trying to discuss is basically how the war of World War I is going to look dramatically different from any war that had actually come before it. We talked a lot about trenches, we talked about no man's land, we talked about what it looks like, we looked at trench diagrams, we looked at those things and things like that. Now, we might actually end up like sneaking in a little video and stuff like that in the description down below, and you can actually see real footage from World War I, right? Now, the thing about it, though, in the long run is we were talking about this as in the entire war. Now we have to get back into the things like kind of in order, right? We know that like this warfare is going to result in stalemates. We're going to know what no man's land is. We know what over the top is. If you want another good scene from like a movie and stuff like that, you can always go back and watch Wonder Woman, because Wonder Woman does a decent job of actually representing World War I warfare. Now, there are going to be major battles, though. Major, huge battles, Katie per tweet, that are going to happen that you're going to need to not really remember, but you're just going to need to know that there were some large-scale battles. Like, for example, the Gallipoli campaign, the Dardanelles, right? That Strait of the Dardanelles popping up again. Jutland, those three being like the three only major naval engagements or areas over, or like actual battles over waterways that actually really happened in most of the war. The Battle of Verdun being one of the biggest ones, where actually the very first use of poison gas would be perpetrated. The Somme is a really, really screwed up one, where it's actually going to be mostly between British forces and German forces, where literally 1.3 million people will die within a handful of hours. Stupid Douglas Haig. Like, this guy named Douglas Haig was like the leader of the British forces. He's like, oh, if we just shell them with artillery shells for an hour and a half, then we'll probably be fine, right? We'll go out there. The British soldiers charged over no man's land after trying to get rid of like the German barbed wire. Still there, right? So, like, still there, and then they get decimated and stuff like that. Passchendaele was another really screwed up battle where, like, it had rained for several days beforehand, and at Passchendaele, like, many soldiers drown in the mud trying to cross over no man's land. The Ypres campaign, the casualties will be extreme because of these stalemates, right? Because the stalemate problem with trench warfare is that you're just inventing technology to outdo the piece of technology that just came before you, and so there's just leading to massive causes of death. And also, it's because they're fighting these wars in really outdated modalities, right? So the thing about it, when I just said Douglas Haig a second ago and stuff like that, Douglas Haig is a lot like a lot of these military officers that are leading this war. They're very outdated. They're using outdated ideas. Douglas Haig himself was a member of the cavalry, right? He thought that all it would take was going to be a triumphant cavalry charge on men on the back of horses going up against like machine guns, and they would just break through the trench lines and simply roll them up in either direction, and that was going to be the way you were going to win this war, right? In reality, these stalemates were really resulting in wars of attrition, right? This war was becoming more of a war of attrition, right? To give you an understanding of how World War I was fought, a war of attrition is basically the same kind of sense that World War I and the Civil War will be fought in, the American Civil War, I mean. A war of attrition is you are just constantly fighting until one side simply just runs out of supplies, right? You are fighting until the other one can simply no longer engage in war anymore, and they will surrender because they have to, right? So the thing about it is that this war was super stressful, very chaotic, and very grotesque. There were some shining moments in it, though, that are super important, like, for example, the Christmas truce, right? The Christmas truce was in 1914. It was at the very first Christmas of the war itself. And it just kind of demonstrates to you this entire idea that maybe Marx was right. Maybe working men really do not have any country. Maybe they understand that they have no reason to really be fighting against each other. And by Christmas, that nationalistic fervor is kind of wearing off. That nationalistic fervor of like, oh, I'm going out to fight for France, and this is going to be a commanding victory for France. And by the time 6 months go by, or 5 months go by, and the trench lines are just getting longer, and the wars are just getting more aggressive, and the battles are just getting more intense, and the Marne is showing us that machine guns will dramatically change the tide of this war, soldiers were defeated. burnt out, didn't want to fight anymore, and Christmas was rolling around. And also, speaking of this Christmas, a dramatic storm surge came through, and it rained for days and days and days on end. And the governments of these countries had realized that like morale was very, very low, and they were like, oh man, our soldiers really don't want to fight anymore. So the governments began to send basically like care packages to every single soldier, right, depending on where they were from. For example, the German care package had like pipe tobacco in it and dried sausage and like some jams and things like that. The British care package had like matches and cigarettes and some different other British items like British teas and things like that all inside of it. And the thing about it was, though, that this rain destroyed most of the gifts brought to them, and so like this Christmas morale was even lower. Many of them had seen their friends die. Many of them had tried to write home to their wives and loved ones, saying that they do not want to fight in this war anymore. And then all of a sudden, on Christmas Eve, 1914, December 24th, 1914, all of a sudden, when the firing actually broke off for a minute and the guns fell silent for a moment, French and English soldiers began to hear a Christmas carol being sung from the German trench, right? And they were singing Heilige Nacht, Stille Nacht, which literally means Holy Night, Silent Night, right? Or Silent Night. They were singing that in German. And then the French and English soldiers, so moved by this Christmas song, began to sing back to them, right? And then they started just throwing jokes back and forth to each other and laughing. And this began to spread down the trench lines and things like that. And what happened was one of the most beautiful moments in all of history. The men left their trenches and went out into no man's land and actually hung out together. And they talked with each other. They refused to fire on one another. They exchanged gifts with one another. They actually gave each other items and things, and they shared their wares with one another. Apparently, a German officer that had previously been a barber in England gave haircuts to men. A friendly soccer game broke out between the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. The Allied Powers apparently won. The Allied Powers apparently won 3-5 or something like that. Now, they paused for an entire holiday. They had little Christmas trees in the middle of no man's land. They buried their dead in communal graves. They had a mass, and they had a beautiful moment. All the while, apparently, this beautiful moment was going on. There were still even some people sitting in the trenches going like, this is disgusting. Why are we commuting with these people? And one officer in particular refused to allow his German soldiers to go out into the field and join in the revelry and join in good times. And he wrote in his journal, it is disgusting that we are allowing these things to happen. And that guy's name was Adolf Hitler, right? Lance Corporal Adolf Hitler actually disapproved of the Christmas truce. What a tool. And then immediately after Christmas was over, they just went back to fighting one another. But it's a moment like that that just demonstrates to you that human beings are involved in war. Just like human beings were also back home, right? There was a massive movement in the home front going on in these different countries and things like that. The home front was mostly, by the time we're getting past 1914 and into 1915 and 1916, when all the recruiting offices are seeing a slowdown in usage, they're starting to have to conscript men, right? Conscription was beginning to start, which is the drafting of soldiers into the war. There was a heavy amount of draft dodging, and a lot of different individuals are going to be sent off to prison because of draft dodging, because most of these draft dodgers were actually socialists, right? And they refused to fight in a war because they felt that there was no need for it. Welfare money is being funneled to veterans and widows. Censorship of the press is happening. The hunting of spies, right? There was even actually this one family in England who was accused of being spies for the Germans, and they didn't speak German and had nothing to do with any kind of sketchy socialist spy networks going on. But of course, most of these people that were being denounced as spies were just socialists who were denouncing the war. Women were incorporated into production and society. This is going to lead to a massive suffrage movement as well. These women right here are actually the Pankhurst sisters, who tried to use the war as a method of being like, young men, go off and fight this war, and the women will stay behind and work in the factories, and that's why we deserve our ability to vote, right? So the Pankhurst family is going to be very, very heavily effective in the growth of suffrage movements and the helping of leading to the right of women to vote in the 1920s after their ability to actually enter into the production models during the war itself. Unrestricted submarine warfare and blockades are going to be created as well. The regulation and production of war materials provided ample arms. Hunger riots are breaking out in Germany. Capitalism is being abandoned, and they're moving towards planned economies and rationing, right? So the big thing that I want to hinge on, though, is this concept right here. unrestricted submarine warfare, because that's going to heavily affect what's going on in these different areas, right? So let's talk about the sinking of the Lusitania that occurred in 1915, right? So the thing you need to understand is that the Lusitania is a pleasure cruise boat, right? The Lusitania is much like the Titanic. It's actually even created by the same company. So what was being practiced by the Germans was a technique known as unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare is the concept of when a submarine would roll up on any target in the water considered a zone of war, whether it be a civilian cruise ship or a supply liner bringing things to Britain, and if they saw it, they would sink it if they entered into these restricted zones, right? And the Lusitania was a boat much like this. The Germans tried to say unrestricted submarine warfare is being used because the United States is illegally smuggling goods to the British. And we actually were. Now, the big thing about it, though, in the long run, is that this boat, the Lusitania, would be sank by a British Unterseeboot, right? Like, so by a British undersea boat or a British U-boat. It would kill 1,200 civilians. They found out that there were several million pounds of supplies going from the United States to Great Britain, and also 128 of the civilians that were killed were Americans, right? So this sinking of the Lusitania is going to be a very, very important thing. But the thing about it is a lot of people always immediately ask, they're like, wait a minute, did the sinking of the Lusitania immediately lead to the U.S. finally joining the war effort? No, it didn't. It just led to this guy, Woodrow Wilson, being like, hey, Germany, quit it. And then basically he denounced their unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Germans agreed to put a stop to unrestricted submarine warfare and the killing of civilians and civilian targets for a time, right? Now, what the British are going to respond to that, though, is in 1916, they're going to start setting up blockades and minefields to try and basically starve out the Germans, right? So you see all these little red areas right there? All these little red areas are North Sea minefields, right? So the big thing about it that you need to understand is this is what one of those mines looks like. Where'd you go? Where'd you go? I had a picture of you up here 2 seconds ago. It was a really, really good one. Where'd you go? Come on. Come on. So mine. No, mine. No. Man. All right, so North Sea minefield. Here we go. So this is one of those mines, right? So these minefields were actually set up all over that map that I just showed you, right? So any of these red areas had these water mines or these sea mines, right? Actually called an MK6, dropped into the water to prevent submarines from being able to pass through them or bring any supplies to Germany. So as you can see, the war of attrition modality and idea is catching fire very, very quickly. And they're trying to effectively starve the Germans out. And that's going to lead to hunger riots in Germany and things like that. And eventually, the Germans picking up unrestricted submarine warfare again, right? So now, the biggest thing about it, though, is as we're analyzing this war and we're understanding what it looks like, and down in the description, you can see footage of it and stuff like that. And then also, you know that there are major battles. You know the weapons that were being used. You know what it looks like. I also highly recommend that you watch the film 1917 because it's absolutely fantastic. So, like, the biggest thing about it, though, in the long run, you know that hunger riots are breaking out in Germany. You know that there's a suffrage movement. You know that rationing is going on. You know all these other things. You know women are entering factories. You know that there's a North Sea minefield that's being used, and you know what unrestricted submarine warfare is, and you know about the sinking of the Lusitania. You got to understand, though, that's all happening on the Western Front, okay? So there are two fronts to this war. There is a Western Front, which is going through France, and then there's the Eastern Front, because Germany is fighting this on two separate fronts, right? They have the Eastern Front and the Western Front. The Eastern Front is being fought against Russia, which is the one group or power that the Germans were mostly worried about. But the thing about it is that the Russians are not faring well in this war. And what Russia is going through, you got to know kind of some of the backstory as to why they're struggling, right? So a quick recap on Russia and why they're doing so terribly in World War I. You got to understand some key things that are going on. One, freeing the serfs, the economic downturn, and industrialization, right? That first wave of Russian industrialism didn't really work out for them the way that Alexander II had hoped, right? So the big thing about it that you need to understand is that Alexander II is now dead and Alexander III was in charge, and he tried to have a second wave of industrialization. And the second wave of industrialization was mostly known and understood by trying to build this thing, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, right? So the second wave of industrialization was mainly trying to build this giant railway that would go all the way across Russia, leaving from St. Petersburg, cutting through Moscow, and going all the way over here towards China, in the area known as Manchuria. Reason why they wanted to do this is because that is where the Russian sphere of influence had been established. Remember when we talked about the Opium Wars? Remember when we talked about spheres of influence? The Russians had established theirs here during the later part of imperialism, and they're trying to greedily get a lot of different resources out of China and transport them all the way back through on this railway, right? Well, the thing about it is, in the long run, is that is not going to work out expressively as they had hoped, due to the fact that there is another power that really wanted to have the goods that they were getting out of that place as well, right? Now, the big reason why is because the Japanese wanted it as well. Remember, after the gunboat diplomacy that was put forward by the American Admiral Matthew Perry, they had actually opened up, and the Meiji Restoration led to them industrializing. Now, their industrialization then led to them wanting to be involved in the imperialism game, right? They learned from Europeans what imperialism was, and they began to try and enact it themselves. The Japanese then wanted to imperialize an area of northern China, known as Manchuria as well. But wait a second, this Trans-Siberian Railway goes all the way to that area. The Russians got a little salty about this, and a war broke out, known as the Russo-Japanese War, right? The Russo-Japanese War, which the Russians were expecting to handily beat the Japanese, ends up in an embarrassing loss for the Russians in 1905, which then leads to a massive revolution that failed in 1905, characterized by one massive event that's very important, known as Bloody Sunday, right? Bloody Sunday is the key event, not that one. That's the, that's the one in Ireland. I'm talking about the one that happened Bloody Sunday in Russia. All right, so that is the big event that actually occurred in Russia in 1905 following the loss to the Japanese and bread riots breaking out all over the entire country. And what had happened was a large number of Cossack guards under the command of Nicholas II, the current Tsar, who's an idiot, by the way, decide that they're going to run into a crowd of protesters, open fire on them, and kill a massive crowd of peaceful protesters, right? So you have to understand that literally over 1,000 people died in this entire thing. Oh wait, 990. Oh no, I'm thinking of the Kandika tragedy. So 96 people died and 333 were injured because they were literally showing up just to try and find bread for people. And it was led by a group of priests. This failed revolution would lead to the establishment of a couple of different things, like this thing known as the Russian Duma and everything like that, this thing called the October Manifesto. But in the long run, the thing that really came out of it was the fact that they were basically behind. And they were still being led by an absolutist. And that absolutist was an idiot. That absolutist's name was Nicholas II, right? They had the smallest middle class out of all European countries, even after this failed revolution in 1905, which we'll talk more about when we get back to class. Smallest middle class out of all European countries, largest gap between the wealthy and poor. They had the largest army in the entire European sphere, but their army had the least amount of supplies, right? So they had the biggest army, but some of them didn't have guns. Many of them didn't have boots. Many of them didn't have uniforms. Many of them didn't have winter provisions, and many of them were aggressively underutilized because their industrialization was lagging so far behind, they couldn't keep up with the demand of the war. So what's going on is they're also being led by dummies, right? The people like Nicholas II, the Tsarina Alexandra, which the Russian people absolutely hate because she's actually German. She's not actually Russian at all, and her Russian's not very good, so whenever she would try to speak to people, she would get embarrassed and kind of become recluse and run away. But they are also being led in the background by their Russian mystic priest, Grigory Rasputin, right? So now, the big thing that you need to understand about it is we will go over in depth these three figures in class, because that is one thing I absolutely refuse to not talk about on my own skis into your face, which is Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, and Grigory Rasputin. Now, the big thing about it, though, is that no one's struggling as much as Russia, as you can see, because they're having a massive amount of casualties. Their army is why are we fighting this war? I don't even like the Tsar whatsoever. Oh, and by the way, the day that the Tsar became Tsar in the 1880s, he literally, had a big party called at the Kandinka Field in Moscow where, I don't know, 1,600 people will be trampled to death when the cops show up. So, like, no one is enjoying the Tsar and his rule. Russia was united for a brief moment at the very, very beginning of World War I, at the outbreak of the war, because conservatives were like, ooh, we can gobble up some more area and get some territorial gains. And the liberals in Russia were like, oh, maybe this can push more democratic reforms. Because basically, after 1905, the Russians got a legislative body, and it was called the Duma. But the Duma, spelled D-U-M-A, literally had zero power. Nicholas could dismiss it at any point. He literally could do whatever he wanted to still. He was an absolutist with a phony rubber-stamped legislative branch, right? So the liberals were like, maybe if we win and stuff like that, this will actually lead to us getting a legitimate legislative branch and a constitution and getting some democratic reforms from the alliances. But the Eastern Front is going to be mauled by, the Germans. Russian armies are going to get stalled out on the Eastern Front. There's not going to be nearly as much trench warfare used on the Eastern Front because the ground was so frozen and cold most of the year. 2.5 million Russians died in the first year. 2.5 million. That is a ridiculous number. And so, between 1914 and 1915. And the Eastern Front is going to keep getting pushed all the way back into Russia. Oh, excuse me. So as you can see right here, that is the original Eastern Front line. Then it gets pushed to right here when the Russian Revolution starts. Spoiler alert. And then this right here is where it goes all the way back to in 1918, right? So as you can see, the Russians are not doing well. Their offensives are not working, and nothing is going well. And the conquered areas that are being taken over by the Germans and Austrians, who are Russian people who speak Russian, are going to be being taken over by Austrians with a heavy amount of Slavic prejudice, right? 1 out of every 3 local Russian would be killed or become a refugee. Farm goods are going to be stolen by Austrian armies. Disease is running rampant in the occupied territories. Russia is having a terrible time in this war. Absolutely awful time. And they're being led by absolute non-discourse, not good, very bad leaders, right? Sorry about that. I had to get a cup of coffee to get this cough to go away. Now, anyway, so the big thing about it, though, is Russia is absolutely getting mauled in this war, and they're being led by terrible people, right? Nicholas II, who is now the current Tsar, following Alexander III, the conservative one who, of course, followed Alexander II, he married Tsarina Alexandria, right? And so she is actually going to be mainly used as a tool of reproduction so she can try to have his child. Now, the biggest thing is they end up having 4 daughters and 1 son. Their daughters' names were Tatiana, Olga, Maria, and Anastasia, which we'll talk more about a little bit later on and things like that. But going into it, they also have a son named Alexei, but Alexei is a hemophiliac, and that's why they end up hiring this Russian mystic wizard named Grigory Rasputin to try and help him out. But in the long run, after all this stuff is going forward, Nicholas decides during the middle of the war that he wants to leave and go command the front lines. Bro, you're already a bad leader. Do you really think that you should be leading the Russian army in war when you have no formal military training whatsoever? Probably not. But what this did is it left the Tsarina and Rasputin to rule in his stead back in Moscow. This is going to lead to a massive amount of resentment going forward, because within a year, a plan was hatched, and conservatives who blame Rasputin for the terrible war progress assassinated him in December of 1916, okay? So what's going on, as you can see, is that there is a growing amount of anti-monarchical vibes. There are a lot of people that are like, we don't like the Tsar and his wife anymore. They're awful, and it's galvanizing the poor people together, and it's leading to people being able to be like, you know what? Do we really need a Tsar anymore? Maybe we should take them down. Maybe we should have a revolution. So, spoiler alert, there's going to be a massive revolution in Russia that happens in 1917 during the middle of their war, and that's what we're getting into right now. So the thing about it, though, is Rasputin, oh, Grigory Rasputin, I love to teach about you, but I refuse to teach about this big weirdo, this big Babadook, this big creeper, then on a flip, not doing it, we'll talk about him in class, right? But literally, he gets stabbed, shot, poisoned, all this other stuff, and these, the Tsarina is left there by himself. Also in the background, while Nicholas II is on the front lines trying to lead the Russians in war, people are deserting. They're literally just deserting. They're like, I don't want to play anymore. And they're just like running back to their families back in Russia and stuff like that, rather than being stuck on the front lines. And by 1917, bread riots are breaking out all over the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It is getting so unattainable that Nicholas is forced to return back to St. Petersburg in 1917. And that's when this thing known as the February Revolution happens. Right after the death of Rasputin. Now here's something weird. Technically, the February Revolution happened in March. So we're now getting into the Russian Revolution itself. So if you want in your notes, you can go like, Russian Revolution. So we're literally going to take a break from what's going on. But you just need to know that in the background going on right now is World War I back in Europe, right? World War I is raging. Germans are fighting the French. Austrians are fighting the French and the British. And the Americans still not involved yet. Still not involved yet. We're over there like, hey Britain, how's it going? Any Russian submarine sinking anything anymore? Not Russian, sorry, excuse me. Any German submarine sinking anything anymore? No? Okay, we're cool. You guys keep going. All right, so the big thing about it, though, is this war is ravaging the entire continent of Europe. And now, on top of everything else, you got riots breaking out in the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, as you can see right here. Now, the first thing you need to know about the Russian Revolution before we go any further is that it happens in two phases, right? It happens in two phases. The February Revolution, that actually happened in March, and the October Revolution, which actually happened in November, and you need to understand them because they're two very important different phasematic things because there's one guy that's going to show up. But the February Revolution were unplanned uprisings and protests that were going on in the street held mostly by former army officers, former military men, and people who had deserted the front lines, right? They begun in March. Massive street demonstrations were going against Nicholas and the military, and what's going to end up happening is Nicholas feels that the best thing he can do is abdicate the throne. And that's what he does, right? He abdicates the throne, and what the Russian government decides to do is abolish the monarchy altogether. Nicholas abdicates the throne, and this thing known as the provisional government would be created. So in March 1917, Nicholas is no longer a royal in Russia anymore, and he is taken under arrest by the new thing called the Provisional Government, which is led by this guy named Alexander Kerensky, right? So as you can see right here in the Daily Mirror, which is a Russian or an English publication, is you can actually see the abdication of the Tsar of Russia. The Grand Duke Michael becomes regent. Amazing news from Petrograd, right? So now Alexander Kerensky, though, is the guy that ends up taking over as the leader of this thing known as the PG, or the Provisional Government, which is that old Duma, right? The old Duma that actually got dismissed by the Tsar multiple times, which now is not limited by any of his power, decides that they want to pass a lot of sweeping laws. 1, equality before the law, right? No class will be treated differently before the laws of Russia. The rights for unions to legalize and strike and things like that. And the royal family would be arrested and detained in a very large palace in Russia. Now, so the big thing about it, though, in the long run is this is going to anger several people because you're going to see the rise of a fake government, a phony government known as the Petrograd Soviet. So first of all, before we can even talk about the Petrograd Soviet, you got to understand what a Soviet is, right? A Soviet is a very important little group of basically soldiers and workers, right? So technically speaking, a Soviet is a group of people like the Russian deserting the Russian deserting military members and then workers who are the ones actually having these big bread riots, right? So what's going on is that think of it like a political labor union, really honestly. Think of it like a group of soldiers and workers coming together to try and fight for their rights. But the thing about it is they decide to also go form a new secret parallel government known as the Petrograd Soviet. Now, what's Petrograd? Petrograd is what St. Petersburg's name gets changed to because they were like, you know what? The monarch is the one who named it. It's way too Western. Petrograd's way more Russian. So let's go Petrograd instead of St. Petersburg. So the Petrograd Soviet is formed. And the thing about it is, what's a Petrograd? Yeah, like that's St. Petersburg. This thing starts as a fake rival government to the provisional government because they believe that there's no way the provisional government under Alexander Kerensky is going to fix everything. So the Petrograd Soviet is this creepy in-the-background government that's passing laws and stuff like that and just telling people on the streets and just telling everyone these different things. One of the biggest ones that they do is the example of Army Order Number 1, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is what they're going to do is Army Order Number 1. Army Order Number 1 is going to be passed by the Petrograd Soviet in 1917, and it's the idea that no one elected your army officers. They were born into hierarchical families, which is why they got their stuff. So if any army officer tells you to do a thing that you don't want to do, just say no. And also, if you want to desert, do it. And so this led to a massive amount of people returning over land and food and deserting soldiers and stuff like that. So obviously, as you can see, the Petrograd Soviet is just trying to stir the pot. They're not really organized yet. They're this creepy provisional government, or like not provisional government, they're this creepy fake government that's trying to fight the provisional government by just trying to undermine them, right? Even though the provisional government led by Kerensky is trying to pass equality before the law and trying to do better things for Russian people and stuff like that, it's not going to happen or get listened to because the Soviets, which are these workers and soldiers, are just trying to make them look bad. But then enter this guy who returns to Russia in April of 1917. Returns, as in was not there for a while. His name is Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, right? So Vladimir Lenin is going to return to Russia from exile and decides that he wants to lead the Petrograd Soviet towards the Russian Revolution, right? And lead Russia into a new phase of existence, and he wants to make them a communist country. Vladimir Lenin, let's talk about who he is real quick, right? Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, a very, very stoic figure, a guy's face that you need to remember, is very important because of where he comes from. He studied law as a young man, and he revised Marx's teachings, and he believed a communist state could exist if you had that violent uprising that would destroy capitalism, like Marx always talked about. And he said also that the only way a communist-like country can become, or a communist revolution can happen in the modern era, is that place must be industrialized, right? Which Russia had been working towards in this entire process. He also said that this revolution would need leadership by a group of elite figures who are educated. So the big thing about it, though, that you need to understand is that he is going to start a party that is going to exist inside of this Petrograd Soviet and inside of the provisional government. And they are called the Bolsheviks, right? The Bolshevik, what it means, is a member of the majority faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party, okay? Now, the biggest thing about it is they existed inside of this communist party. And the Bolshevik, what the word Bolshevik means, is majority, right? Now, the minority was known as the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks wanted to work with the provisional government and do things like Alexander Kerensky was doing in the process of equality before the law, and they didn't want a violent uprising. And the crazy part about it is, though, is how did this guy make it back from exile in the first place? Well, first of all, let's talk about his life as a young man, right? So his brother, adopted socialist teachings at a university and actually tried to overthrow the government on his own at one point. And what's going to end up happening is his brother is going to be held for trial and then executed. And then Vladimir Lenin would be actually exiled to Siberia for a handful of years before then being permanently exiled being permanently exiled out of Russia, where he would end up in Switzerland. Now, here's the crazy thing that ends up happening. The Germans are very aware of all the things going on in Russia. They heard about the February Revolution and the fall of the Kaiser and him abdicating the throne. They heard that the Duma was taking over. They heard that a Petrograd Soviet was actually happening and that there was a rival government challenging the Russians for authority. So they decided to intentionally smuggle Lenin back into Russia. The Germans put Lenin on a train and brought him all the way back to Germany. And he shows up and gets off the train station on April 16th, 1917, spouting the ideas of bread, land, and peace. What we're going to do is you're going to stop writing right here, and we're going to start talking more about Lenin and the Russian Revolution when we get back to class after break, because I got to make sure that you understand, because I know a lot of this stuff can be kind of confusing, but I'll get you there. Don't worry, okay? Y'all have a good one.